Quite a story we have here today. Jesus walking on the water. There are a couple things that I would like to point out in the story. It talks about that the boat battered by the waves. Can you imagine that boat? That's an important thing for us to realize in this story. And also, Jesus says that Peter, he says, "You of little faith." He doesn't say, "You of no faith." Little faith is somewhere between the absence of faith and maybe we would say the abundance of faith. But I think it's important for us all to realize that Peter had faith. Peter is the sort of representative of the disciples, and representative of kind of all the disciples. And so we can assume that all the disciples had faith. They were following Jesus. Many of them walked away from their fishing jobs in order to follow Jesus around and learn from him. The other thing to pay attention to as far as the words that this author, the author of Matthew, chooses to write is when they're really afraid in the boat and say it's a ghost, Jesus speaks to them and he says, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And so in this, we hear that theological, those words that God claims when Abraham asks him for a name. I am. Some translations it is, "I will be who I will be." But we come to know in the stories in the Old Testament as God as the great I am. And in this story, for the disciples, Jesus is claiming his relationship with God and telling them that he is God. I am. Also, we need to remember, or I will tell you, that God walking on water, this isn't a new metaphor, theme, miracle that happens in the New Testament. We have scripture in Job that says God walks on the water. God walks in the deep crevices of the waves. Again, it's not necessarily about the power that Jesus has to calm the seas. That's a great metaphor. It's a great truth. God can do whatever God wills to do with this creation that God has created. But more importantly, in this story, Jesus is telling them who he is. In the story before this, Jesus has fed over 5,000 people. The women and children didn't get counted. So if it's anything like the families going to River City Food Bank, we can assume that it's 5 times 6 because you've got mom and dad and 4 kids. That's a lot more than feeding the 5,000 with those loaves of bread. It was that miraculous. And don't jump to the place in that miracle where we say, well, Jesus probably really didn't feed them with the loaves of bread and the fish. He probably created an atmosphere where people were generous and sharing. That says a lot about who we are, but it doesn't say much about God. And the story in the gospel is about Jesus and God. And so, Jesus can still those waters. Jesus can walk on that water because God can. And the people listening to the stories believed that. The whole story of parting the sea and walking through, it's a miraculous story. And it's a metaphor. And the author of Matthew, whoever wrote the Gospel of Matthew, is telling the people, telling us, that when we follow Jesus as true disciples, we will get battered. It will be difficult. And just like Peter, at the height of our belief, when we are standing out on the edge, we too will become afraid and will falter. And if we believe in Jesus and believe in God, we too will be saved. And Jesus will come and bring us back safely in the boat. This is a story of faith. Maybe it's a little faith, but it is faith. And what I have learned is faith without trust is like faith without works. It is great to believe in God. It is great to believe in a power greater than yourselves. I hope we all believe that, and I hope it brings us all comfort. Because thinking everything is on our shoulders, no wonder we have crazy people out there. Because that makes you crazy. But believing that there are some principles and rules to live by, that Jesus has come here on earth to teach us, principles about love, principles about justice, principles about mercy, those all bring us to grace. Grace brings us in relationship with God. And it is God who gives us grace. But folks, we have got to be willing to open ourselves to it. And if we believe that we have the power and we don't need God, grace has no room. It is like the light is shut out. Open your hearts. Trust. How many of you would get out of the boat like Peter and try to walk on water? I think we have different personalities in this room. I would, and you know that, right? Those of you who really know me, you know that I would be like the first one going, me, pick me, I want to go. But I also would be one of the first ones to sink, because I too get afraid. I too am afraid. And the irony is, especially when God is working so powerfully in my life and things are going so great, I start looking behind me going, what trouble is going to follow me? I don't need to. I need to look forward. But here's the secret. If I take credit for what is going on and God's blessing, I am sure to fail. And I am sure to be afraid, because then it comes back to being my responsibility. But if all my responsibility is to follow God and let the Spirit come in and be with me and guide me, I can do that. That's when it continues. That's when I have a life beyond my wildest imaginations. And it is true of St. Michael's as well. We have a long history of this. Thurlow Baker came, Father Thurlow Baker. He is our founding rector. He looked around and he said, this campus is way too big for Sunday services. We have got to do something with this. And he trusted. Took a long time, and many of you were in that and made it possible. I am sure that you were afraid sometimes, had to get back in the boat, get settled, but you got back out. Because we have that school in the back of our property. And no matter what, it is our ministry. We provide the land for it still today, and we partner with them still today. And still today, God is in that school. They honor Thurlow Baker's original core values. And they help those children learn about spirituality and learn about God. They still gather weekly, 3 or 4 times in this chapel. That is God being at work. And how we trusted, at some point, we let it go to become what God wanted it to be. We do this in our relationships with River City Food Bank, with Loaves and Fishes. We write a check to them. Every month, our treasurer writes a check. We don't check and see if we have the money. Through your generosity, we don't have to, because we are financially grounded and sound. And we know that it is important. We support St. Matthew's, both the center and the mission. We do our due diligence. We stop, we check periodically, but we do not fret over it constantly. Because we know how generous you all are. And we know every month when that soup pot comes around, we've got Ed Lynn banging on the side and asking us all to be as generous as we can, because he's out of the boat, trusting you will. Because God doesn't want anyone to be hungry. Miracles in this place happen all the time. Hearts are changed when we learn more about who we are as a Christian community. We learn more about the Old Testament and the New Testament, and about theology, the study of God, through our EFM programs. And every year, we worry, are there going to be enough people? And every year, God brings curious souls forward who say, I want to know more. And we keep on keeping on. We have to keep our eyes open. We have someone who's been here a while, but who's come more recently, who's very involved in the prison ministry. We have not taken it on in a big way, but we go home and we make those cookies and we bring them in because it's part of that program. And we believe that if God is calling someone in our community to do something like visit the prisoners, which is a direct mandate, by the way, does it on our behalf. And we support him so that he can go in abundance with our prayer and love. Those are places of trust. And sometimes it's absurd. It's the absurdity of it that I love the most. Can we all agree that it is completely absurd that Peter wanted to walk on water like Jesus? It's absurd, right? Come on, is it? Went to a movie this weekend, Jules. I can't really tell you all about it because it's a really sweet movie and I want you to go see it, but I'm just going to tell you that it's about an alien that crashes and in order to get back has to do something that is wildly absurd. Wildly. Has no, and the funny thing is that my husband and I went to see this movie and we never even talked about how absurd what got that ship back together was. We just took it for granted. But the three people, they just did it. They didn't say, oh my gosh, how can we afford this? They didn't say, how, it was like, how are we going to do this? And they had some ideas that were equally absurd. But they did it. Because they had faith and trust that they could. They just didn't even think that they couldn't. Get to a point in your life with God where you stop even thinking that you can't. Oh my gosh, the anxiety that would be removed. You're still going to get battered. The boat gets battered. It's real. The world batters you around. But you don't always have to feel afraid. You don't always have to feel anxious. This whole experiment called the Christian church is pretty amazing, is it not? It is a miracle. And we can talk about how in 300 or 400, how the Roman Empire took it over, and we can go on, but the reality is that there are so many people, past, present, and in the future, who followed Jesus and Jesus' love and made a difference in so many other people's lives. That's what matters. When the difference is faithful to God, it is good. So I pray you will trust. Open your hearts, be willing. And what it takes a big dose of is humility. At the end of the day, ask yourself, Where did I trust in God? And where did I go it alone? And I'll bet in those places where you went alone, it's pretty sketchy. But when you trusted in God, it was probably miraculous. At least that is my experience. I share that with you today because that is what I think the good news in this gospel is. Trust God. Go out on that limb, because even if you get battered, Jesus promises to keep you safe. Few bumps and bruises, few wrinkles. Life's going to do it to you anyway. Go with God. Way better. Amen.